And good evening, friends, to all over there, all around the globe. I'm just watching the Facebook Live, that is why I'm a little bit confused. My apologies. We are struggling with the second wave of COVID-19 pandemic. Hope your family and nearest one are safe. Today, we are live through the Facebook page of Global South Coalition for Dignified Menstruation, but there is a technical issue. If you don't find directly over there, my colleague Swapna Paudel, please check the Facebook page of Global South Coalition, Radha Paudel Foundation, my Facebook page, personal page, Radha Paudel, Swapna Paudel, you will get the link over there. Global South Coalition for Dignified Menstruation is a global network initiated by Radha Paudel Foundation in Nepal for re-examining our past and reimagining our future through the dialogue on dignified menstruation all around the globe. Today, we have a friend from all the way from Scotland. Her name is Dr. Camilla Røstvik. My apology if I pronounce not well. She will present her experience from Scotland, Scandinavian countries, and some extent from the global south and the global scenario. She will explain or present about 30 minutes presentation, and we will go on question answer. If you have any questions, queries, please feel free to drop in our messenger or comment. Our colleagues will collect and will forward to us, and we will try to attempt them. If not, we will attempt these questions in our next webinar session. Dr. Camilla is an art historian at the University of Leeds, and she also an author. Let's welcome her. Welcome, Dr. Camilla. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. I'm going to share my screen, so pardon me for a minute. Let's see, and hopefully you can see that now. So thank you so much again. So I've been asked to come here and talk about Scotland and dignified menstruation today. And as Radha said, I'm an art historian who's been working mostly as a historian, but for our purposes today, I'm part of a collective of researchers who look at menstrual history in Scotland. And so I thought what I'd share with you today is some of the things we've been tracing the last couple of years, because Scotland within the global north has become a kind of center for policy and debate and also controversy on menstrual health. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with giving you some background. I'm going to go to some historical examples from art and activism, because I think it's very important to remember the people who got us to the point we're at today. I'm going to talk about the policy itself. So in Scotland, there's a policy that makes it a law that everyone has access to menstrual products. I'm going to talk in great detail about that. And then I'm going to talk about the aftermath, what happens after a policy like that. So that's the plan for today. And as you can see from this slide, I'm starting with some examples from history. So Scotland is an interesting country in many, in many ways. It is positioned within the United Kingdom. It is partially devolved, meaning that it has the right and opportunity to set, for example, educational agendas, but not military agendas. So it is slightly independent in some ways and part of the United Kingdom in terms of a political and trade union. As you might also know, the United Kingdom left the European Union this year, And so there is a debate now about whether or not Scotland would like a say on that and go for a second independence referendum. And there is an election in Scotland on the 7th of May this year. And so I'm telling you all of this just to underline the fact that we are in a time of intense political debate in Scotland, and menstruation is part of that debate, believe it or not. And I'll try to explain myself. So before we get to politics and where we are today, let's go to the past. I'm showing you 3 images here. The one in the center is the oldest one, and it's actually a quite crude watercolor from an artist working in the 1890s. He was a surgeon, and Scotland, for a long time during the 19th century, was the leading center of expertise on women's reproductive health and surgery. So what you're seeing here is kind of a uterus taken out of the body and a growth from a disease. And what it underlines is the intense interest in medicine in Scotland, surrounding anything to do with menstruation, reproduction, pregnancy, and menopause. So when we talk about menstrual history in Scotland, I think it's fair to say that it began, as it often does in the global north, with a medical perspective. And that could be quite narrow, it could be quite patriarchal, but it could also be positive in that at least there was an interest in helping people who had painful reproductive disorders. So this medical debate was challenged by feminists in the 1960s and 70s. So we're talking, a good 70 years later. So Scotland, like a lot of countries in North Europe, had a kind of feminist awakening in that decade. And we see 2 things coming out of that. We see a critique of the medical model of menstrual health, a critique of the industry, a critique of tampons and pads. And as the book I'm showing you on the right, the sanitary protection scandal, attests to, we see a critique of the environmental impact of the industry. The next thing that happens is a more creative, artistic, and controversial view of menstruation. So if you look at the image to the left, Heavy Flow, this is made by a punk artist who lived in Glasgow during the 1990s. And she made this homemade sign and would pass it around to artists and activists in Glasgow to raise the issue of menstrual stigma, to poke fun at the industry and really transgress. So these magazines were full of, cartoon images of blood, and they really were quite provocative at the time. So this is kind of the, a simple introduction to the Scottish history of menstruation, which is a combination of this medical model, a feminist protest history, and a quite funny, frank debate driven by counterculture. And you'll notice that that comic book is from the 1990s and it's from Glasgow. And we'll come back to the importance of Glasgow, the city, in a minute. So from the 1990s to the 2000s, we see an increase in grassroots campaigning, activism, and politics. And there are different groups involved in this. There is a campaign to help people who attend sports facilities have access to products. It's called On the Ball, and it starts in the 2000s. There is a UK, so a British campaign, not specifically Scotland, started by Amika George, who's the young woman you see in the upper right corner, around the concept of period poverty. So that is people who cannot afford products. We see a political engagement from the women's movement for an independent Scotland. So you can see here that there are political kind of affiliations here in coalition with the Labour movement and the Greens. So actual political parties getting involved in this concept of period poverty. And you have artists and culture makers setting the scene too. So in this film I'm showing you, I'm sure many of you might have, if you follow menstrual culture, this was one of these important moments in Britain, at least. Daniel Blake which traces the everyday life of someone on the poverty line in Britain. And it features a very moving scene of someone who has to steal menstrual products in a shop because they can't afford it. So these various things, the cultural highlighting, the political interest, Amika George, her work and campaign in Britain, and the Scottish sports activist campaign, all of this kind of creates a pressure towards politicians. There are more and more young people in particular asking, why do we have to pay for this stuff? And by we here, I mean everyone. Why does anyone have to pay for it? And thinking about period poverty, why should this be an added burden to people already living with poverty? So this grassroots campaigning, activism and politics, it grows from, I'd say, about 2005 and explodes in 2015, being covered by mainstream journalists in Scotland, in the UK, and then internationally. We see Scotland being put on the map because there's so much activism here. The next thing that happens is that politicians take notice. And so I'm kind of sharing this history for those of you in other countries, because I'm very interested to know if this is happening at similar stages elsewhere, or if other countries, so I'm aware Kenya has kind of similar policies, whether they got to this at the same speed or did things differently. So the way it worked in Scotland is that you have the activist stage first, and then the research stage. So as I was saying, activists were really calling for transparency and information from policymakers. They were asking, why are the products, why do they cost this much? Is that good value for money? They wanted to know basic, important questions like this. And then they also tied this issue to the question of dignity. They wanted to underline that when people feel that they can't afford or can't access menstrual products, they might feel embarrassed. So it wasn't as simple as being just about products. It was always connected to larger questions. So in the UK, the NGO Plan International, which works internationally, but this was the UK office, made a very influential report into girls' experiences of menstruation in the UK. All of these reports are very easily available for free online, and I urge anyone with a policy interest to read them carefully, or contact me if you can't access them, because they're very interesting. This first research report from Plan International UK found that most young people, girls and boys, were embarrassed about menstruation in the UK, and that included Scotland. It also found that there were huge barriers to access for products, and that poverty was indeed, of course, a problem. But it also underlined that people who were not poor sometimes also found it embarrassing to buy or ask for products. Overall, the report said that menstruation was a time of anxiety for people, and that much more could be done to make people feel more comfortable during this stage of education. So as you can see, they were focused on girls. Now, after that report came out, the Scottish government and the Scottish Labour politician, Monica Lennon, took an interest in this type of research and the debate that ensued. And the subsequent report about the Scottish status quo was written, and that's called the Access to Sanitary Products Aberdeen Pilot. So Aberdeen is a city north in Scotland, and basically the Scottish government ordered a case study to see, okay, so if the situation is so bad, what can we do? What they did was provide free menstrual products in one school, one college, so secondary education, and one university. And this was an interesting test of the practical issues facing those who were rolling this out. For one, how would you check if someone actually needed the products? Remember, this policy and the focus from the activists was on poverty, not on everyone. So the natural conclusion of this, that you couldn't check that, it would infringe on human rights to ask someone, well, prove to me that you can't afford the products. So basically they found that the best way to make them available for anyone who needed them was to put them out for free in, say, a public bathroom. And they found that when they put in place systems where you had to ask for products, no one wanted to ask. So there was still stigma. The stigma was holding people back even when the products were free. And the Aberdeen pilot therefore provided the Scottish government with an example of, you know, the challenges in making provision free, but also the potential. And they noted that, for example, people who had never been interested in trying, you know, pads or tampons or cups were trying new things and finding them more comfortable. They also found an interesting, not maybe a decrease in stigma, that's difficult to measure, but willingness to talk a little bit more openly afterwards. And it was underlined by the report that the products needed to be mixed in with education somehow. So it's a very interesting report. And the Scottish politician I mentioned, Monica Lennon, subsequently put forward to the Scottish Parliament a proposal for a bill, as you can see here, to end period poverty. So it's a very interesting kind of move here. We're going from looking at girls who struggle with poverty to looking at everyone, and then back to poverty again. But we've kind of looped in absolutely everyone in the process. And now it's about ending period poverty, but the research has kind of shown that this is an issue for everyone, irregardless of financial income. That's an added pressure, but it's not easy to talk about these things for anyone. The next stage is the bill itself. So in our research group, we've spent a long time looking at the politicians who debated this bill. And I'm just showing you here the kind of front page of the final part of the 2019 version, and then there were subsequent tweaks. And, you know, as politicians do, they debated all sorts of issues to do with this. The politicians on the Conservative side were asking about value for money and how much it would cost. The Greens were very concerned that there were inclusion of environmental options and things that were not disposable. Labour kept a firm focus on the issue of poverty, and Monica Lennon and her most kind of active colleagues on this kept an overview of everything. So the Period Products Free Provision Scotland Bill, as it became known, basically in the end, what they could all agree on was this, that the Scottish government must set up a Scotland-wide scheme to allow anyone who needs period products to get them free of charge. And here you can see that we've moved away from the poverty focus, and it's really about, I'd say, human rights is a rights issue. And Monica Lennon during this time seemed to be realizing that menstruation isn't just an issue that affects some people, but that it's a human rights issue, a human health issue, right? And specifically, the products should be available in schools, in colleges, and universities. And they needed to be a range of period products, so not just tampons and pads from the big brands, but a bit of everything. And that these should be provided in the toilets, because that's where the Aberdeen pilot study found it was most useful. Finally, and quite interestingly, I think for our purposes here, the Scottish Government will have the power to make other public bodies provide period products for free. So you might think about libraries, swimming pools, you know, the things that we could do before the pandemic. The Scottish Government has the availability to broaden this bill and to influence other official buildings to take on this issue. So the bill got immense interest when it was passed in 2020, and we saw, I think, an explosion. I mean, I said it, there was an explosion of interest in menstrual activism in 2015, but in 2020, we saw, our team tracked media interest from just about around the world in this issue. And the claim that Scotland was the first ever country to make it, a right enshrined in law to have menstrual products provided, that kind of headline was translated into numerous languages and made its way around the world in 24 hours. So you could say that this proves that in a way, the stigma around menstruation has perhaps changed because there was so much media scrutiny, and at least it was possible to talk about this. On the other hand, there was also excellent PR for Scotland at a time where its political future is a bit uncertain. So all of this, I've talked about the history, activism, the bill itself, politics. How does this actually look on the ground? In Scotland, yes, schools, universities, colleges will have free provision, and that is organised through the janitorial teams in whatever building they're in. But there is also provision in food banks. So this is to ensure that that initial focus on poverty is not completely lost. So our research team visited the Cerillions, which is a charity that works with one of the biggest food bank systems in Scotland, and they got tasked with rolling out the products. So basically, I'm showing you these images of how it looks like. The container, you go inside, there's tons of products. They are paid for by the Scottish government, and the charity provides them to all the food banks, prisons and correctional facilities that they already work with regarding food, for example. So they're kind of linked into an existing system and just adding menstrual products on top of that. And because Scotland had this existing system, it was relatively easy. But as you can imagine, it was also added work for the people who work in these charities. But they seem to be used to suddenly having these things thrown at them because politicians had decided it. So the result of all this was, just before the pandemic, this was starting to be rolled out, and you could start to see it. You could start seeing menstrual products appearing in public buildings. People in food banks could access them freely, and you could also access them online as well. So it was quite an immediate change in Scotland for those who needed products. Now, last, I'd like to talk a little bit about the aftermath, because the promise of this bill was that it would eradicate period poverty. And so for activists that we've talked with, activists in Scotland, there is a sense that this issue is kind of over now. If you need menstrual products in Scotland and you can't pay for it, there are several ways, even during the pandemic, that you can get them. But activists says that this, of course, doesn't solve the poverty issue. So within the UK, as in the rest of the world, anti-poverty activists are increasingly skeptical of this, splitting off food poverty, period poverty, energy poverty. And they remind us, of course, that it's all just poverty. So did this actually help in terms of the big strategic economic plan for the country moving forward? So you see, that's a very critical reading. But there's also very positive readings. So the Scottish government, for example, has not stopped its engagement. It's been working on Period Dignity Scotland. And I'm showing you here the poster from a conference they organised in January this year, where they brought together activists, charities, schools, colleges to talk about, how has the bill affected them? And you can find that recording also online, or email me and I can send you information. And that was a very interesting debate, because there was both a sense of real joy that the issue had been, quote unquote, solved, and then a true kind of energy in wanting to keep this conversation going. So for all the people who had become really interested in menstruation during their work on this, they didn't want to stop. They wanted to look at What about menstrual pain? What about the still ongoing stigma? What about endometriosis? So what we've seen in Scotland is a shift towards other menstrual topics, but it hasn't quite yet, maybe because of the news environment right now, it hasn't quite peaked like that bill did. And then there's the issue of the products themselves. So, some of you may know that the UK also continued looking at this. So Scotland did its option of free products, and England and the UK are looking at a different option. So in England and the UK, they've partnered with big corporations. And in Scotland, they've partnered with a social enterprise, so not a company per se, but a company called Hey Girls, where you buy one product and then they donate one to someone who needs it. So how this effectively works now is that, if a school orders in, 200 menstrual cups, they will cut the cost in half. And that's how that donation works. So what we've seen is the rise of this social enterprise, Hey Girls, in Scotland, which is Scotland-based, and they provide most of the products now with some other products. So there's a question here too about the role of corporations in driving change. And then finally, as to the question of, period dignity in Scotland, it seems to me that there has also been a political consequence of all of this. For any one of you who have read about Scotland and its radical menstrual policies, you might have thought, wow, Scotland, really radical place, must be full of, feminism and friendly policies towards all sorts of people. And that is exactly the kind of message that, of course, is good for a country, and certainly on the precipice of such an important election. So in a sense, we've seen Scotland really benefit from this positive reputation abroad. And I think we could even argue that that's a form of soft power that it's using. And because of this soft power and the positive reception from other countries and national bodies like the EU and the World Health Organization, we've seen Scottish politicians move in this direction. One of the things that was so interesting about the bill is that it was unanimously voted on. So in the end, everyone voted for it, even though, there were people who questioned various details. And that's quite unique in the UK. You wouldn't find that so easily in England, for example. So this reputation has meant that those politicians are now more likely to support other policies that are progressive. So we've seen policies about making it completely legal to breastfeed in public. We've had a big debate here about hate speech and also racism. So we can see this menstrual policy and its positive reception perhaps clearing the way for Scottish politicians to think about, okay, so they like this, maybe this is, what the people want, but also how we want Scotland to be. So whether or not Scotland goes independent, it was a great kind of PR move on the political scale. And then on the practical scale, it's really made a difference in some people's lives. We know that too. And we know that some people, remain critical to some parts of the policy, but that there is a debate within Scottish government about how to improve it. So I think I've kind of used my time here, and I'm more than happy to talk to you about Scotland, but also how it sits within, the Northern European model towards menstruation, contrast with Scandinavia, perhaps, or whatever you want to ask about. So thank you so much for listening, and I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Camilla. It's really very enlightening presentation. And usually people don't think about the politics while talking the menstruation. Menstruation considered as a personal, women's or private concern, right? But you highlighted the issue all about the politics. Recalling the history of Monica speaking in the parliament and making the world awakening, right? So it's really a very moving presentation. Thank you so much. And still wanted to know about the politics again. Could you explain a little bit in a very simpler way so everyone can understand? In May 2nd, you will have a election in Scotland, right? So how does the Scotland's election impact the life of a girl, menstrual girl, or the child? How do you see, or how the individual or ordinary people can understand the issue of menstrual politics?
Yeah, the election, the election is a normal election in that there's lots of political parties, but it's seen really as a, kind of a mini referendum. So if the Scottish National Party does well, they will fight for a new mandate for a referendum. So that might mean that there might be a new vote after the pandemic about whether or not Scotland should be independent. Now, you'll recall in 2014, they voted no. And so there's huge debates here about whether this is a good idea, if it will happen. But what's quite interesting is that when you zoom out from the menstrual policy and look at the other things that the SNP have done, because they're the leading party, in collaboration with other parties, they are really, they are fronting a lot of progressive social democratic issues like this. And the menstrual policy arguably is one of these. It's not the only one. There's lots of stuff going on, the rights of gay and lesbian people, on trans rights, on anti-racism, lots of these things. So I guess the question for voters in Scotland is whether they like that stuff and want more of it, or whether they want to turn to a different sort of politics, more akin to, the United Kingdom, for example. Whether it makes a difference in the life of a menstruating girl, as you ask, is a very good question. I don't think we know so much about the lived experience of Scottish girls. We know a lot about girls struggling with poverty in Scotland, but that's very specific research, right? So for girls struggling with poverty in Scotland, we know that life is difficult, full stop, and that free menstrual products can certainly help part of that, but it doesn't stop there. So the poverty debate is also something that's really being discussed as this election moves up. But it is interesting to think about menstrual politics as politics with a big P, because that's certainly how, we've seen it played out here.
Thank you. Since you have experience in Scandinavian countries as well, would you share a little bit about the status of the menstrual practice over the Scandinavian countries?
Sure. Yeah. So my own background is from Norway. So I guess I'm in a kind of research group that looks at menstrual history in Scandinavia too. Yeah, pretty different than Scotland and the UK. The debate about poverty has been smaller. I think maybe people don't talk so much about poverty in Scandinavia. It's more difficult for activists to make that a mainstream debate. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but the Scandinavian countries like to think of themselves as, wealthy. And so in Scandinavia, it's not so much about poverty as it is about stigma. We've seen a lot of artists and activists experimenting with, free bleeding, art, really transgressive, controversial stuff, some would say. And we've seen a media debate in response. I think maybe Sweden is ahead there. So there's been, I'd say, a handful of artists who've really done work that kind of made a difference in the public conversation. Especially Liv Strömquist, who was commissioned actually to decorate the Stockholm subway train station with menstrual images, cartoon, but featuring, bloodstains and everything. And that started a debate. Some people loved it, some people hated it, but she said that she did it to combat stigma. So it seems to me that the charities and activists and artists there are focused on breaking down that kind of what's so dangerous about blood? And there was a book that came out. I can't remember she's called Liv, but I can't remember the last name. An author who wrote a book in Sweden about menstruation a few years ago, and it said, the title was, "It's just a bit of blood." And I think that really summarizes, the activist perspective there. It's not so much about, poverty. That's not to say that it shouldn't be. It's about, what's the big deal if you bleed, right? So I'm generalizing, but that's something I've observed for sure.
Okay, thank you. I also like to know more about the differences between English approach of period poverty and Scotland approach of period poverty. To me, once someone say period poverty, that means it is only for the poor people, homeless, refugee, the migrant people, poor people, something like that. It creates some sort of discrimination among the mensurators. This is how usually people understand. But you claim that Scotland is something different, far ahead. It is considering the political issue. So would you differentiate a little bit between the two approaches?
Yeah, I think, we saw this quite clearly in the debates about the bill in the Scottish Parliament. And we can compare that to the End Period Poverty Task Force that the British government created. So we have these two bodies to compare, and they have freedom to act in their own way. So in the British one, the discussion was very much about poverty. It really was. And focused on coalition with corporations who could quickly access products to schools and people in need. And it did consider research, it did consider stigma and so on, but I'd say that, they quite quickly moved on once they felt that there was products. The Scottish issue was a bit broader, perhaps because there wasn't political debate in the same way. In the end, most of the politicians agreed that this was a good, uncontroversial idea, and so they discussed a lot of other things instead. So in these debates, they discussed stigma, they discussed pain. There were politicians who seemed to be, for the first time in their lives, questioning, hey, what are these products made of? So the conversations they had led to, I think, consciousness raising amongst the politicians, and that was quite interesting to see. And so it's led to more things in Scotland. So I showed you the Dignified Menstruation in Scotland conference. They also had a campaign about words. So a campaign called Just Say Period, to get people to say period rather than, Scottish codes and euphemism and humor. And that was, on bus stops everywhere. So the approach has been very, very different, but you could also argue that it fits very well with the politics of each nation, each coalition, Scotland being slightly more on the left and Westminster conservative, right? So it makes sense that there's like this pro-business, pro-corporation collaboration in Westminster, and a more situated towards what the activist wants in Scotland. Yeah, I don't know if that answered your question.
No, there is no wrong and right answer indeed. We all are learning, and if we see the history of the mensuration overall, we don't talk much. We started to talk since 1970s, especially in the academia. Before that, we talk more about the medical perspective, how the uterus get pregnant, what are the issues related with the obstetrics or gynae, but we don't talk really about the mensuration. Mensuration or uterus is the entry point to discuss about entire issues: economical, political, social, cultural, historical, environmental, whatever you define. There are, wherever the menstruators lives, there are so many aspects or dimensions to discuss about the menstruation, but we don't talk. So just recently we started to talk, and we don't know, and we every day we are learning. So no worry, we just trying to bring up the questions within ourselves, and also trying to attempt to bring the answers as well. So it's just a way of hammering all stakeholders who are interested on menstruation. So it's okay.
Yes, and I like your point about it being, you know, I think activists often, they know this, that it's all about lots of different things that intersect with menstruation. But it was really funny watching, you know, the politicians, some politicians who had that eureka moment, and maybe had never thought about this. And maybe this campaign didn't begin to consciousness raise and educate politicians, but it doesn't hurt, you know. It can only be a good thing, I think, that politicians know the basics of a menstrual cycle. I mean, it's really important information.
Yeah, totally agree. For Global South Coalition, when we talk about the dignified menstruation, it has to go throughout the life cycle, from womb to tomb. That means we talk about the premenopause, menopause, uterus prolapse, the cancer, even after death in some cultures. Because this universe exists due to the presence of the menstruation. And we spend so much time and money at the name of the girls' empowerment, girl power, but we are not trying to reach out the childhood of the girl children, right? So how do you see, let me say again, what is still left to do to ensure the dignity during menstruation across the global north?
Oh, I mean, everything is left to do. I guess one thing that has been solved, not completely solved, but we've started the debate about, I don't even think, you know, yeah, maybe period poverty, that term is contested and complex, but we've started the debate about access to products. We've also started the debate here for certain about endometriosis. I've seen that kind of skyrocket. On the horizon, there is more attention towards menopause now. But it is very interesting to measure the attention paid to this bill and to this issue of poverty compared to other issues, including poverty. I mean, if you are a journalist or an academic who does work on poverty in the UK, I mean, you're going to have a hard time attracting a lot of media attention. For some reason, this really gripped the public and the media. And I think, you know, we got to question why that is. So why are some menstrual topics popular to think about and some are just in the shadow? I don't know, but I think following, you know, the work of Chris Boble, that this had a technology fix. It has a fix with products, and it doesn't matter if you're in the global south or in the global north, that message is quite seductive. And for politicians, you know, they're voted in to solve problems, and they solved a problem here. It's more difficult to solve, you know, endometriosis. That would take so much time and so much money, and you know, there is no money. So I can understand it, but I think the big conceptual problems, you know, why is it embarrassing to bleed? What's normal? What's not normal? What's healthy pain? What's dangerous pain? These things really need more attention. But we can be hopeful, I guess, that the people who had their consciousness raised through this bill, for example, in Scotland, that they start asking those questions. Because I think for all of us who are interested in menstruation, we came to it through, like, you know, one thing, and then we started seeing all the other things. So I am hopeful, but I think there's so much more to do. And I'll just say, like any researcher in the world, that, you know, we need money to do this research, and our medical colleagues need money to find out, you know, the basic biological issues of pain and disease too.
Yeah, I totally agree. We strongly believe that the dignity must be the entry point, no matter what kind of things or research you have been doing. Right now, if we see the few groups are very much vocal on the product, they forget about the stigma harassment part, the rumors. The few friends are more focused on the West, so there is a kind of fragmented. And those friends who are more vocal on the PMDD or the health issues, they said, they keep highlighting, and without the normal physiological phenomena or the fear, the complications dominated the normal mensuration. So it's a very imbalance. That is why no matter what kind of thing we have been doing according to our expertise or the donor interest or the available of the funding, we strongly believe that we need to enter through the dignity perspective. Dignity is just not like for using the word of the dignity. Dignity is really a miserable. It should be the miserable indicator everywhere, in the public space or in schools or in the workplace or in education, in OS. So there should be the indicators everywhere, so no one left behind, because we all living in the era of the Sustainable Development Goals 2030 by reciting the slogan of no one living behind, and our movement looks like everyone living behind. Okay, I want to hear from you more regard to the missing points. Somehow you have already covered what kind of things are missing in the global menstrual movement and why. Would you elaborate a little bit in very specific manner so our colleagues understand and try to attempt accordingly?
Yeah, I guess it depends, you know, what's missing. I guess it depends on what type of menstrual issue you're working on. I think if I can kind of generalize across Northern Europe, at least on the Nordic countries, there's a tendency here to, at least in kind of the media debate, to keep forgetting that there is a history to this movement, and a very unfortunate tendency to compare us with the global South in a very patronizing way. And it's such a shame, because I think that, you know, historically the global South has been leading on this, and it is now that the global North is following. I mean, you know, period poverty is just another word for, you know, whatever people have been talking about for 30 years across the world. And it's a shame when the media kind of positions it as us against them in a really patronizing way. So I think that's missing the awareness that this is a global movement, and that activists have, you know, they work globally and together, but for some reason there's still this tendency to you know, in a really unfortunate way, to like separate us. So that's missing, and that cuts off experience to learn as well. So for policymakers in the global North now working on these policies, I don't know, but I would hope that they are learning from colleagues in the global South. I don't know, I haven't seen that much evidence of that, but then I'm not there in all the private conversations. So I think this international collaboration and learning from people who've been doing this for a long time is missing, because if not, there's this tendency for us all to be discovering the issue again and again and never moving forward. And then the other thing that's missing is the medical research. I think COVID really underlines that, you know, the first data collected here, you know, here and elsewhere, not paying enough attention to pregnant people, for example, and then with the vaccines, not including certain groups in the category. And so we know we have this issue with an uneven medical research field that looks more at, you know, male bodies as a default still, and so that needs to change. And then third, I guess is like a maturing of the policy itself. So what happens when you have solved the product issue? Should there be a way of policymakers of thinking, you know, what next? And I think in a way that the Scottish example is a good example of that. Maybe it happened a bit randomly, but it did happen in that they did this product thing and then something else happened in terms of the language and the stigma. Maybe more things will happen, I don't know. But to think about, okay, so if you are in the lucky position to solve the product issue, then what? Because you're of course going to find that the stigma is still there. You know, it was never that easy as you know, activists have been saying for decades. And I think it's about those three things, about learning from each other and not dividing us up into sectors of the world, more resources to medical research in particular on this issue, and then thinking about what's next after you fix the product question. So those are top of mind for me anyways, but I know there's much more that colleagues, you know, can remind us of.
Yeah, totally agree. I want to back to Scotland again. How has the Scottish bill worked in the pandemic?
Yeah, good question. So all of this happened and then the pandemic happened. So, you know, they had planned it so carefully. There was going to be, you know, universities and colleges had the power to do this kind of how they wanted to within the toilets. So some people used a free vending machine, some people had little baskets. It was all planned out, and then, you know, it all stopped. So it's moved online. And from what I can see, what they've done is that they've given each region of Scotland the power to set up a website or a part of the website on their regional web presence, and then you can order products on it. And I actually had a look just before speaking, and so the way it looks, you come to this website, you put in your address, you don't have to put in any more information, and then you pick what you want. So there's an option of, for example, 4 reusable pads and 1 cup, or 2 packs of tampons and 3 pads, you know, whatever you need. There's like bundles. And then it said that it would come to you in a box, which is discreet, because discretion is still important to some people. In a, you know, a black box or something like that, it would come straight to your home. So that's how they've dealt with it. And that seems to me to be quite a, you know, they've turned that around quite quickly. And I wonder if they'll keep that option after the pandemic too, and just complement it with, you know, when you're out and about in the real world.
Wow. Here in Nepal, the government incorporated the menstrual product into the logistic supplies of the pandemic COVID response, and NGO also replicate the same practice, and that is why the products are available in quarantine and other health centers. But in the beginning of the COVID pandemic in Yuan city of China, the frontliner female health workers used birth control pills to avoid the menstruation because of this stigma. So no matter whether we have pandemic or not, or any kind of disaster like earthquake or Ebola or typhoon, actually the menstrual needs and priorities have to considered. But unfortunately, still it's a big debate, and usually the humanitarian workers usually lead by the men. The humanitarian activities are led by the men, and they don't like to even think about it. If someone think, they don't like to put the appropriate budget, and even the stuffs over there, the frontliners, usually men, at the name of the risk bearer and smart. And again, some people don't like to toss and they just throw it. And by the time the mensurators do not know how to use it during the menstruation and after the menstruation, I mean the waste management. So there are so many issues, and sometimes it is frustrating, sometimes it's inspiring. Let's inspire from the challenges.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, and
Yeah,
I was just going to add that the issue of birth control is very interesting. So I don't know how many people are on birth control in Scotland, but I think it's the majority of young women at least. So there's also a question, this came up in the debate about how needed is this? How many people are actually menstruating, and no one seemed to know, which is very interesting. And people take birth control to avoid menstrual pain, fertility, and also to avoid the stigma of menstruation. And then the second thing this came to mind, you were asking about the pandemic, is that there is a researcher in Scotland, and I think with a colleague elsewhere, who has set up a survey, which I'm sure you can kind of Google or find somehow, about people's menstrual symptoms after having the vaccine. Because anecdotally, there were reports about changes. Of course, there's also changes due to the stress of living under a pandemic, or if you've had COVID. So I think that's a kind of interesting, a very quick response from researchers. They're thinking, how can we be useful and help people and calm people down? So that's also an exciting development, and I look forward to see, what they find, if anything.
Yeah, I also read one news about the post-COVID menstruation. Few menstruators experience the changes their menstruation. Some experience heavy flow. So we need more research on that, to what extent the vaccine impacted on our overall menstruation. And in regard to the birth control pills, I heard the garment factory workers, especially the women, they also have been using the sports, and some use voluntarily. They don't like to have a menstruation. That is why they wanted to suppress the menstruation. So there is a stigma, there is a issue with the product, there is an issue of the education, ignorance, and people keep using the different things. That means no matter what kind of issue we are talking, the ignorance, the silence is underneath. There is a thick layer of the ignorance and the silence on the menstruation in the bottom. That is why it is very difficult to bring or to reach out the bottom of the issue. And we have been experiencing, means the universe, this universe experienced the menstruation since times of Homo sapiens, 4 billion years already, but we don't know much about the menstruation. It's some sort of frustration, some sort of sameness, and again, we need to move on. We need to, no way, we cannot go back. So we are very close to the our time. Today we experienced the technical problem, so we live from different Facebook page, but the link is already shared in different Facebook page, and also it will publish very soon in YouTube, and it will available over the website and the Facebook page, Twitter, Instagram. Thank you so much, Dr. Camilla. It's really very enlightening and very inspiring talk. It is really, really short. We need to talk again in future. It's our honor to have you indeed. Friends who are following right now and will be following later, please keep following us. We have been trying to bring the different issues from all around the world. Sometimes pick up the speakers, expert activists from the global north and sometimes from the south, depending on availability of the speakers. Next month, we are very close with the menstrual month. May month is considered the menstrual month because it's the 5th month out of 12th. And we will be organizing various programs in Nepali, English, and different other parts of the world. I mean the chapters of the Global South Coalition. Keep follow us. And before saying goodbye, I want to invite Dr. Camilla to close with the last message for dignified menstruation. What should we do, or any thoughts, final thought from you? Thank you everyone.
Thank you, and thanks for having me and sharing. I've learned so much today from speaking to you too. So I think my final message is very simple. It's listen to the activists in your community. Don't get sidetracked. Politicians, corporations, social enterprises, researchers, we all have an agenda. So do activists, but they tend to have the ear, close to the ground. They know what's going on. They work with local community. So if in doubt on how to build a menstrual policy, I'd say listen to the activists. I think that served the Scots well. Not perfect, but well. So listen to the activists. Thank you so much. Thank you.